So when you are going to define the variables, you need to keep in mind a very important point, and that's the scope of those variables, or the scope of identifiers we say here, right? What it means by the scope of identifiers. So when you define, for example, a variable, right, then you may want to use it in different parts of your program. So it's important to know what is the scope of that variable and whether that variable would be recognized in, for example, that special part of program that you are going to use. So that's the general view of the scope of, for example, one identifier. So here what we have is, for example, block scope. What it means by block scope? It means when we have an identifier like a variable and we define that variable inside a block, so we can use that inside that block. So outside that block, we cannot use it because the compiler does not recognize that variable outside that special block. So we say its scope is block, right? That's completely obvious. For example, what it means by a block, blocks like methods body, right? Because the method body is inside the opening braces and closing braces, or for example, loops, right? Like for while. So for while we have opening braces and closing braces. So whatever goes inside these opening braces and closing braces, right, are actually in one block, or for the if statements, right? So they are block. So that's what block means. So when you define a variable, for example, inside a method in the method body, so that variable is recognized just inside that method. Right? So that's the scope of that identifier. That's the scope of that variable. There is another notion here that is good to know, is that we say such variables are local, right? It means these variables are just recognized inside that local part, inside just that method. So outside the method, for example, in another method, if you want to use, if, for example, you have two methods, and inside the method number one, you define some variables, you cannot use those variables inside method number two, right? Because those variables are the local variables of method number one. And the scope of those variables are block, right? So they are not recognized outside that special method. So that's what you need to know about the scope of identifier. So it's good to know when you know what is the scope of each variable, each identifier, so that when you are going to use them in your program, you don't face any error. Well, let's see some simple examples to clarify the scope of identifiers more. So here we have a class, a general class, right? And its name is Java Application 1. Inside our class, we have our main class, that the main statements, main parts of our code is going to be inside this main class, right? I'm going to define a variable that is going to be a class scope, right? In the in this whole class is going to be recognized. So how I will write up public, then static, and for example, this variable is going to be, its type is going to be double, so double, and then the name of the variable. So now this variable x has class scope, and we are going to study about that more later, but it's good to know that it's a class scope. It has class scope, and in this class, in the whole class, it's going to be recognized. So you can use it in the whole class. And inside, so the my main method, I'm going to define some other variables. So these variables will be the local variables for this main method, because they are going to be defined inside the body of my main method. So they will be recognized just inside this block. So they are block scope, right? So double A, B, and C, for example, and X, Y, and Z. I'm going to use them in the next lines. So these three are the local variables to main. These three are local variables as well. And I'm going to initialize these variables A, B, and C. So I'm going to say A should be 1.3, B be 2.5, and C be 6.8. I mentioned before that the variable x is a variable that has the class scope, right? So in this entire class, it's going to be recognized, and we can use that. So now I can show this by writing down some lines of code. So here I have declared this variable. I can initialize this variable inside my main method, and I'm going to say that x be, for example, 0.57, and system.out.print x. So as you see, x has been printed here, right? So x can be recognized inside the main method, although it's been declared outside the main method, right? But since it's public static, so the scope of this variable is class scope. So in the entire class, it would be recognized, and you can use this variable. So if I want to print A, let's see what will happen. So I can see that the value of A has been printed perfectly. It means, okay, so here this variable can be recognized, right? Since A has been defined inside this method, my main method, so in in this entire block it would be recognized, and I can use that, right? That's why this line of code works perfectly. Let me define another method and call that method, for example, average. So I will define a method public static double average, the same as what we had before. So this method is going to return a double value, right? We'll receive 3 double value and here I'm going to define a new variable total, and total should be the summation of x, y, and z. And finally, it's going to return total divided by 3. So here, this x is different from this x, right? Because it's the one of the parameter of my method. Total is another variable, right? This variable is also a local variable for this method. So I can just use this variable inside this method. So outside the method average, total won't be recognized. So let's see. To show that, for example, here inside the main, if I write, for example, total, you see, and run that, I will face an error, right? Because total is a local variable for my method average. So outside this method, total won't be recognized. So if I say x be, here I call my method average a, b, and c, and then print x. So you see, I could easily print x, and it works perfectly. So right now you recognize that this x is a variable that has the class scope. Total is a local variable for my method average, right? A, B, C, X, Y, and Z are the variables that are local variables for the main. And here I'm going to have, for example, an if statement if x be greater than 10, and I'm going to define some variables, and you see that these variables only exist in the body of the if statement, so their scope is block, and outside this block I cannot use them. So int var, for example, 1, and var 1 be 20, right? And system dot out dot print var 1. Let's run the code. Okay, so since x here is this number, 3.5, is not greater than 10, so this part will not be run. So let's, for example, say x be less than 10. So now you see var1 is 20, and I could print it here, right? It's been printed. So if I want to print var1 outside this block, I will face a problem, an error like, right? So here, since var1 is a variable with the scope of block, so it will be recognized just inside this block, inside this if block, right? So outside this part, I cannot use this variable. So that's a very simple example for the scope of the variables identifiers. I hope it clarifies for you what it means by the scope of variables, and you learn about that. Well, so now you know exactly how to define methods, right? There are some important points about methods. First, about parameter list. So I mentioned that parameter lists are those lists of parameters that your method is going to receive as the input, right? So methods can have no parameter, or it can have several parameters. So in the case that it has no parameter, it means it has no input. So there is a very important point that you should keep in mind, and that's when you are going to call your method that has no input, you should use the parentheses after the name of the method. But inside the parentheses, that you don't need to write down anything because your method has no parameter, right? So that's the important point about a method without the parameter. The other point is about the return type. I told you that return type is the type of the result that your method is going to return. So if your method is going to return an integer, this return type will be int. If it's double, the return type will be double, right? There are some cases that your method doesn't return anything. So the return type here will be void. In general cases, when the method is going to return something, I told you that inside the method body, you need to use the keyword return, right? And after return, that special expression that your method is going to return. But if your method will not return anything, you just need to omit that expression after return. But you can use that return inside the method body. So by using the return inside the method body, the statements inside the method will be executed, and when the execution reach the return keyword, it will be exited immediately from the method. So that's the point of using just return when your method is not going to return anything. So now that I talked about the methods and I showed you some important points about methods, it's good to show you some simple examples. I told you that in methods we have the parameter lists, and there are some cases that we have no parameter list. Or for the return type, there are some cases that our method doesn't return anything, so the return type will be void. So let's clarify these points better for you with some simple examples, right? First, I'm going to write down a simple method that is going to have no parameter list and is going to return a character. So public static char get a letter, that's the name of my method. So as you see, it has no parameter, it doesn't receive, it doesn't get any input. So this method, what it does, it needs to ask the user to for example, insert letters. It will receive those letters, right? And if that letter is, for example, between capital A or till capital Z or lowercase a to lowercase z, right? Then we say, okay, that's fine. You inserted a letter, and if we find no letter, then we say, okay, there is no letter. So that's a problem, right? So that's the task of this method, right? So let's write down what this method is going to do. So it is going to get some input from user. And then check the first character of that input. So if it is a letter, right, it means if it's between A to Z or A to Z lowercase, then that's fine. Else, it's going to print, for example, a message to the user, not a letter, right? And as a result, it's going to return the letter. So that's the task of this method. So this method doesn't receive any parameter, right? But it's going to return something. If the input is a letter, it's going to return a letter. And if The input is not a letter, it's going to print something for the user, no letter, right? So that's a case, a simple example for method with no parameter list. So we are going to declare some variables. First, Boolean is letter to check that our to check for this part, checking whether it's letter or not. Boolean is letter and char led, right? The character that is going to be returned by my method. So here, what I'm going to do is I want to say as long as the user has not inserted a letter, right? I'm going to repeat that, ask the user to, for example, insert a letter. I will check the input. Okay, that's not a letter. Again, I will show the user, no, that's not a letter. So me as a user will enter a letter enter an input. Then again, that input would be checked again and again and again until the time the first character be a letter, and yes, that's a letter. So the letter will be returned by the method. So as you see here, I need a loop, right? So I will use a do while loop. So do while is letter. Right. So first I'm going to print a message for the user and say, okay, enter a letter of alphabet. So system.out dot print, please enter a letter of the alphabet. So the user here, by seeing this message, will insert an input. So I need to receive that input and put it inside a variable. So input dot next, the first character, right? Char at 0. So input dot next dot char at 0. So I need the scanner here. Public static scanner input new scanner and system.in. Now I need to say, okay, so if this letter is between uppercase A to uppercase Z or lowercase a to lowercase z, right? Whether it is between uppercase A to uppercase Z to lowercase a to lowercase c, whether it's in this range or not. So if it's in this range, the answer will be true, else the answer will be false. I want to save this answer inside is letter. So is letter B the answer of this statement? What was the statement? Whether the letter is in the range of uppercase A to uppercase C, or whether it's in the range of lowercase a to lowercase c, right? So how we can implement that? So is letter B, let is greater than or equal to A, and let be less than equal to Z, or let be greater than equal to lowercase a, and let be less than equal to lowercase z, right? So if let is between, if any of these two statements be true, then is letter will be true, right? But if none of these two be true, then is letter will be false. In that case, I need to print a message for the user and say, okay, there is no letter. So the user needs to again insert an input. So I need to check here the value of is letter. So if the value of is letter is false, right? So if it's false, what it means? So if not is letter, right? Then system.out.println not a letter. So you need to try again. So that's the loop. And finally, it's going to return the letter, right? So that's a simple method that receives no parameter and return a character, right? So let's call this method here inside my main method. So I'm going to declare a variable result and say result be call of get a letter, right? Let's run this code and see what is the result. So I see this message, please enter a letter of the alphabet. So I'm going to enter, for example, 3. So I will see this message, not a letter. Try again. Please enter a letter of the alphabet. Again, 4. So this loop would be continued until the time I enter an input that its first character is a letter. So for example, CH23. Well, so you see, so it's completely worked, right? So if I want to see, for example, system.out.print result, so you see I can see the result, which is C, right? That's a very simple example for a method with no parameter list. Let's see another example for the method that does not return anything. So I'm going to define another method. In this method, it receives 2 inputs and will check the value of, for example, inputs and will print something. It's going to print something, right? So it doesn't return anything. So its return type will be void. So public static void, its name be print So it's going to receive 2 integer, int x and int y. And it's going to check the value of y. If y is 0 equals to 0, it's going to print a message to the user. For example, since it's 0, it's going to print this message will be, I'm not going to divide by 0. System.out.println, I'm not going to divide by 0. So here the return type is void. So that's fine if I don't use the return keyword, right? But I'm going to use the return keyword. But without any expression. Else system.out.println divided by y is right? So I'm going to call this method in my main method. Here, print the name of the method and the numbers be, for example, 5 and 0. Right? So it doesn't return anything. So the return type will be void. I will use the return keyword here. So by executing these lines of code, when it reaches to this point, it will exit immediately. So let's run the code. So it shows I'm not going to be divided by 0, right? Why? Since y is 0 here, right? So that's two very simple examples. So the first method received no parameter, so when I call this method in my main method, I use the parentheses after its name, right? But without any parameter list, as you see here. And the next one was a case that the return type is void. It means it doesn't return anything. So, as you see here, it doesn't return anything. The expression, we have no expression after return, and the return type is void. So, after executing this part, by reaching to this point, the execution will be exited immediately. So that's two very simple examples for these cases. So when you write your method and you are going to call your method, it's good to know some important points that is important for a compiler. So first, when the code is going to be compiled, the compiler will check the method name in the definition of the method as well as in the part that you are calling your method. So both of these names must match. The other important point is that the parameters that are inside the parameter list of your method, their type as well as their orders is very important. So when you call the method, you should write an appropriate data type as the input, and you should use the correct order for those inputs, exactly that match the order in the parameter list. And the other point is about static methods. Static methods can be called through class name, but instance methods can be called through an object. when you are going to use the parameters for calling your method, or when you are going to assign the return value of a method as a value for a variable, if the types do not match, right, then a legal automatic type conversion will happen. So that's very important to keep it in mind. So for example, if you have some variables with different data types and you use them as the input parameter of a method, and their types don't match the type of the parameters inside the parameter list, then an automatic type conversion will happen to make the compilation possible. Or when you declare a variable and with a special data type, and when you want to initialize that variable, and for initializing the variable, you use a method, and the result of that method be different. The type of the result of that method be different from the type of that variable. Again, here a automatic type conversion will happen. I know that it must be a little confusing, but let's see some examples to make these points more clear for you. I think that if you see them in code and program, probably you will recognize and you will learn them better, what it means, for example, by legal automatic type conversions, and what will happen if those data types don't match, and whether they will be compiled or not. So I think some examples can help you to learn them and see them, understand them better. So let's see some simple examples here. For example, let me write. Okay. So in this example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to declare some variables, for example, C1 and C2 to be character, D1, D2, D3 to be double, I1 and I2 to be integers. So here I'm going to define some methods like what we had before. So a method for calculating the average, a method that like before is going to return a character for example, public static char get a character string alphabet, example A, B, C, D, and return alphabet dot char at r dot random, right? It will return a random character. So that's two methods that I have. So the first method will compute the average of two numbers. The next method is going to return one character between A to Z randomly, right? And another method is going to print a message, for example, public static void print values, count and double amount. So it's going to print system.out.println. Here are the two values. And then we have system.out.println. And I'm going to print these two values. System.out.println. I'm going to print count and amount, right? So I have these three methods. I have defined these variables. So I want to call the method average for D1 and D2. So D1 and D2 both are double, right? Right? And here, the type of the parameters that I have in the parameter list of this method both are double, right? D1 and D2 also are double. So this should work, perfectly without any error. So you see that this call doesn't work, right? What if I write D3 equals so it doesn't work, it seems. What could be the reason? D1 is double, right? As we have here x. D2 is double as well, as we have here. Okay, so the reason here is that we need to initialize D1 and D2, right? So since we have not initialized D1 and D2, and we are just passing two variables to this method, so we face an error. So we should say D1 be, for example, 5.0 and D2 be 3.0. And let's see, yes, it's works, right? So that's why this one doesn't work, right? And so the reason is that we need to initialize these two variables. So D1 is 5 and D2 is 3. So what if we say, for example, C1 be average, D1 and D2. So C1 is a character, right? And the data type, the return data type of average is double. So this one is double, this one is character. Let's see what will happen. So you see that we will face an error because of this reason that C1 is a character, but we are assigning a value to this character which is double, right? So here we will have this error. So it doesn't work. But if we write D3, it works, right? Because D3 is double and average D1, D2 is double as well. What if we call this method get a character like that? Get a character. It works, right? This is a method that doesn't have any parameter list. So when we are going to call this method, we just write down its name and then parentheses. What if we don't use the parentheses? Just the name of this method. So you see, we will have an error here. So keep in mind to use the parentheses after the name of the method. What if we write C1b get a character? So get a character is a method that will return a character, right? C1 is a variable that has been declared to be a character. So both types are the same, they match, right? So we expect this line of code to be executed without any error. So you see, there is no error. What if we say I1 B gets a character? So I1 is an integer and get a character is a character, right? So their types are different, but as you see here, an automatic type conversion has happened, so this line of code has been compiled without any error. So although get a character returns a character, and I1 is a variable with the data type integer, right? But an automatic data type conversion has happened here. So this line of code will be compiled without any error. So that's about some points. I hope it helps you to understand that. So here there is an important point about the parameters and the passing parameters into a method when you call that method. So when you pass a parameter inside a method, you actually will create a copy of those variables and pass them to the method. So if inside the method you change those variables, you do some calculation, since the past parameters, the past arguments are the copy of the original ones, the value of the original ones won't be changed, right? So let's see one simple example to clarify this point better. In the right-hand side of this slide, you see a method. This method takes two input as the parameters, right? Two integers, x and y, x and y. It will multiply x by 2 and will multiply y by 2, and finally it will return the summation of x and y. In the main method of the program, as you see in the sample call, we have declared and initialized the two variables a and b with values 5 and 8, and then we pass these variables as the input to the method my method, right? So ans is my method a and b. So when we pass these two variables into the method, a copy of these variables will be passed, and any change in the method will be applied into the copy of these variables. So the original version of the variables and their values will be intact, right? But the copy will change. So that's why when we have system.out.println answer, so the answer is actually the result that is going to be returned by the method is 5 multiplied by 2, 10, plus 8 multiplied by 2, 16. So 10 plus 16, 26. Right, so the first print will print 26. For the second one, we are printing the value of variable a, and for the third one, we are printing the value of the variable b. So what is going to be printed in these two is the actual value of these two variables, means 5 and 8, right? So although we have passed these values as the input into the method, and inside the method, we have made some change on the copy of these variables, but the actual values of these variables in the main method, have not been changed, right? So that's why the second print and the third print will print the actual value of a and b, which are 5 and 8. There is a notion named method overloading, and it means in your program you may define several methods with the same names, right? But here, since the name of the methods are the same, you need to make some changes to help the compiler to distinguish between these methods. So these changes can include the changes in parameter list. For example, the order of the parameters or the type of those parameters can be different, right? So as long as there is some, even small differences in parameter lists, even if the name of the method be the same, compiler can distinguish between them. So we have some examples here. Process is a method, right? And we have 3 methods with the same name, process. But the first one, the parameter list is a double, the second one is a character, and the third one is a double and integer. So the compiler can easily distinguish between these 3 methods, although their names are the same. So it is called method overloading. So if you define your method like that, and then you call your method in your program, like what we have below, x equals process 3.45 and 12. So now compiler knows which process is based on the parameters. The first one, as you see, is 3.45. It's a double, right? And the second one is integer. So it has two parameters. The first one is double and the second one is integer. So it's completely obvious that this method is method number 3. Or for example, for the second one, we have x equals process, and inside the parentheses we have f. So compiler knows that this method is method number 2 because the parameter of this method is a character, right? It's f, right? So in method number 2, the parameter of the process is char letter. So now you know that in some programs we may have several methods with the same name, right? So it can be possible that in some cases we have ambiguous invocation. What it means? It means when you try to call a method, right, but you call it in a way that compiler doesn't recognize which method that method exactly is. For example, if we have two methods like double sum integer x, double y, and double sum double x and integer y, as you see, both of these methods have the same name, sum, and the parameter lists are the same except the order of the parameters are different. So if I call, for example, the method in a way that will be ambiguous for compiler, then compiler cannot recognize which method should be invoked and it causes an error. For example, we have a very simple example here, system.out.print the sum is sum 3 and 4. So as you see, 3 and 4 both are integers, right? So compiler doesn't recognize which method should be invoked, so as a result, it will show an error to you.